What is up, guys? Today I'm gonna talk about universals and the forms, doing distinction between those, because I had a good explanation lately. My father talking about Plato, and he has a PhD in that, so he explained to me further the forms of Plato. Yeah, and I kind of, like me, I talk a lot about universals. Universal in some sense are the forms, but they're not so much that. And it's really interesting to see all the difference. I already talked about some of my videos that I said that the forms are more empty, and I still stand by that. But now I'm gonna show something that I want to talk further down the line actually in my videos, because I think that just typing philosophers and just explaining their philosophy within their types in mind would be very useful in the future. Actually, a series that I want to do when I will be a little more mature with that, with video format, and that will not, I will probably talk in my computer with more editing regarding that, but I will still explain that, because my videos are more thought experiments and trying to kind of develop my thoughts. And I think that's important also, that I talk a lot about universals, and I think that will be useful later on, like in the videos that I will produce actually soon about phenotype and all that. I think that talking about the forms can be very useful actually, comparing it with the universal. So previously I said that, I put a triangle, and I said that the forms were the NT at the top, which is unity, while the symbolic, we can mean symbolic in two ways. That is the merging of the top and the bottom. But oftentimes what we mean by symbolic is really the top, the unity also, but NF. What is the unity, something NF? And the most optimal form of those, they fill the triangle. They fill the triangle, like the forms do fill the triangle, but they are at the top and they are the unity. So the example that my father gave me is pretty much a lot of what I talk with duality on this channel. Like, OPS, we always talk about duality. It's more like there's the circularity of things, and in that absolute, there is 2 points, which are the relative. I talk a lot about that too. So there's a relative, which is the duality, which are the dualities. Dualities is more when there's a conflict. By binary coins is more neutral. A relationship is more when they are enter in contact, and that is more the line. While the circle is more the absolute. And it's the same thing with the time and space. And even now we see a lot of scientists saying that reality is an illusion, that time and space are not real, so reality is an illusion. So some part of that is right, some part of that is false. That yes, in the relative, because you don't have levels, It's like when you have more philosophical stuff, and you kind of divide, you are more a universal basically. That things have levels. So when scientists say that it's not real, it's more that they see that the relative is not real, so they think that the whole thing is not real, but it's a particular level, So it's like the absolute and the relative, they are both a particular level, but they're not at the same level. So it's really important to know the verticality of things, that there is the vertical and the horizontal. Now the horizontal oftentimes being multiplicity, like at the bottom of the triangle, the relative, the duality, the reactive, while the vertical is more the absolute, the unity, something like that. Now it's not always the case, oftentimes more the joining of the two, so it's more nuanced than that, but still absolute can be seen as the vertical and relative as the horizontal, just for us to comprehend that even more, that concept, because it's a representation. So it still minimizes the power of those two concepts by representing it that the vertical horizontal, but it still shows something important, and it's easy to understand in that way actually. So yeah, and universal in my sense is more universal. To me, universal is more that the NT, the NF, but the NF, the NT, the ST, and the SF, all the triangle with the unity at the top meet. So they meet in reality, they all meet, which prove that it's universal. But universal, it does seem that it gravitates more toward the symbolic. And it makes sense, is because it starts to be pretty complicated, but the unity in observation in U is universally NF. So in that way, universal will always kind of have a universal, NF will always have that kind of universal quality, or vice versa, that universal will always have this NF quality, because in unity in observation is always universally NF. So that's why it's that way. But still the universal has to be applicable to the NF, the NT, the ST, and the SF, which ST is more objective. And yes, it meets at the top, but universally, we know that ST and SF is actually the bottom that it meets. And I still don't know with the SF. I think maybe reality, but me, universal and reality can be synonymous, but I think that's not true. I think it's not, because universal is more a representation in our minds rather than the ultimate things, which my father also talked about, you know, that there's the one, you know, in the Neoplatonism system. There's the one, the nous and the intellect, which I'm not sure, when me too I do some Trinity with that, with the Twinkle Trinity, the Feeling Trinity, add in a bunch of stuff if you have seen in some of my videos. But my father seems to say that intellect is that, so it's more that something that it's accessible to us right now. To me, it's more the logos in a sense, but it can be met at all levels, like intellect, logos, and mind, like that aspect, because it's still within the human conscious awareness. So I don't have trouble with that, and maybe just my wording that is different, but it did seem to emphasize more intellect rather than something else. In my sense, when I talk about universal, not that, it's more the nous. While the one is, you know, we cannot describe it in a way. We can only experience it when in a religion and all that. It will be synonymous to God in a sense. And it's more the God that is incomprehensible in a sense. While the nous is more comprehensible, and it's often described as a divine mind or something like that. Which, you know, in my Trinity, my thinker Trinity, I do think that mind is more nous alike, while the logos and intellect is more intellect alike. In that Trinity, you know, how I fit my Trinity in the Neoplatonism Trinity. So yeah, that thing that I'm talking about is just something that we live in all our day and age, our day-to-day life, and that's pretty much the OPS in a way. It's like we live dualities, the relative duality, and we have the non-reactive absolute. Sometimes we come in sense that, but we are more actually in the relative duality. But we do have a sense of absolute actually in everyday life that we reference to aspect on our life that are applicable to everything. And that's actually my father's main argument with the forms, is that, you know, the idea of a chair or a table will always exist, and it's more the relative, like the chair. We always refer to the chair even if the chairs are different around us, which is pretty much an argument for the Platonists. Let's say, okay, the forms are more real, the unity at the top, the patterns at the top, the forms and T is more decisions. So the idea of a rational share that is applicable to everything is more real than the chair because there is variation. So there's also like the OE and the OI, which is pretty much what I said there, with unity being OI and OE being multiplicity, you know. And yeah, so he explained that better than me, but it's like how he write it was actually more accurate. This was more attacking the idea of the chair is applicable to a lot of things. And that's why I think Plato is probably a meta type, so a social type tree, and also probably NISE, so it's pretty much NISE. But in universal intuition and sensory, we will always express that way. But I do think express that way, that in the sense that the patterns are more universally about the unity, and the sensory is more universally about the multiplicity. But still, I do think it's more like a NISE thing. Agreement for that, and in a way that the forms are more real than what we have here, and we can experience it in our life actually, because we do encounter the relative, and it's always wishy-washy, that the chairs are always different, the grass is always different. It always depends on the absolute. Our idea of a chair or something will always remain the same, even if our conception will vary through the times and all that. Still, that idea will always survive. It's a little bit like, and that's the argument of Plato, that life is actually the source of everything. That the idea of the forms at the top, they are life. So when we think we die, we actually return back to another type of living. So that's his argument for resurrection, that a lot of people miss, that my dad said that a lot of people miss that concept with Plato, that he actually advocate for, but I mean it's more Socrates that actually advocate for that we actually resurrect, that we return to the one or the monad, and that's life basically. So a lot of philosophers also mistake that they think that it's an escape of life by promoting the idea at the top, and that life is there. But the problem with those philosophers is that they actually place the relative as the most real thing out there, while it's not true per se, which is a problem of Nietzsche in my opinion. Even if Nietzsche constructed a very good philosophy on that, by kind of demonizing the monad or projecting like Plato, so the monad as the real thing and this essay as fake, he actually has undermined something, that thing that life is in the relative. While Plato said that the essay is illusory, or the relative, the multiplicity, they always change, so they are relative, and they count maybe less than the thing that is unchanging, the thing that is absolute. But he still mentioned that it's life, and that our life is actually life too. It's just that we mistake it for death when we die, while just by the process of the relative, we came to understand the absolute. That's also a core thing, and by understanding the absolute, by living the relative, we come to understand the absolute. And in that sense, we know that when we die, we actually live. So that's actually the Phaedo. It's more his book that he's talking about that. So yeah, thanks for watching. Finally, my video was more about Neoplatonism And talking about the forms, I do think that the forms are still empty at the unit at the top with decisions. And I guess I explain further the symbolic forms, objective, SF and the triangle, how they meet with the universality of the unity and multiplicity, how that connect to the relative, absolute, with the circle and the the duality, and how that connect to Neoplatonism, also my Trinity, that is also connecting with that, and talking about the Plato idea of life that we resurrect after we die because we return to the monad, that is a real thing, but that doesn't mean that the relative world that we live right now is not real. It's just that we actually mistaken life right now as death, when that we die, while we don't really die. So it's not. It's actually more a life. It's more actually positivist and life miracle-like. But a lot of people misinterpret Plato and think that he demonized life, which can be true to some degree, that he actually demonized life with that kind of pattern. And we all know that all the saviors lead the line at the top, social one, promote that idea, or the people that are enlightened have promote that idea. The top, actually life is more the non-reactive, it does the realist thing, or reality is more illusory. While it's true that we see that the relative is illusory and is reactive, is wishy-washy, and it's not really the real thing. Like my saviors and my demons are not the realest thing ever and all that. Like that's still true, but still the most profound philosopher will not demonize the life we live right now. They will not demonize the relative. Even Plato, Socrates use the relative to come to understand absolute, and use the relative to know that actually we return back to life, and that the life that we have now is a life that is not dead per se or demonized. And I think that's a problem that some philosophers have, that it's kind of ironic, by demonizing, by thinking that some philosophers demonize the real life there, and saying that the relative is life. By doing that, they actually do the error of the relative, in not coming to understand the absolute fully, and kind of being too wrapped up in the relative, even if they can have profound insight. Like Nietzsche, I think, is a very good example. So yeah, so whatever. Thanks for watching, guys.